Good morning, or I guess now we've tipped over now. We're now at the noon hour. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to Great Cities Institute. For those who may not know me, Teresa Cordova, Director of Great Cities Institute. So we welcome you and are glad that you're here for our conversation today on vacancy and spatial justice. So we're very fortunate that we have Kathleen Dickhut, who's here. She's Deputy Commissioner, City of Chicago, Department of Planning and Development, and she leads the Large Lot Program, which is a City of Chicago neighborhood stabilization initiative to help property owners, block clubs, and nonprofit groups in select Chicago neighborhoods to purchase city-owned land for $1 per parcel. So she'll be telling us about some of that work today. Ben Helphand is the Executive Director of Neighborspace. Neighborspace is the only nonprofit urban land trust in Chicago that preserves and sustains gardens on behalf of dedicated community groups. They shoulder the responsibilities of property ownership, such as providing basic insurance, access to water, so that community groups can focus on gardening. Neighborspace also links community gardens to one another as well as broader networks. Thank you so much, Ben. We're very glad that you're here. Sanjeev, our dear Sanjeev, who is professor in planning, associate professor of planning. Sanjeev Vidyarthi has research interests in the ideas and actions in the domain of planning, history, and theory. His focus on spatial planning and design, as well as globalization and international planning, makes him a great resource for us here in CUPA. He studies who does and who should do planning work, researching the difference produced. A believer in the authority of careful thought, his projects involve helping actors and communities make better plans that bridge the many divides in society and improve the quality of urban life. So with that, I open up with Kathleen Dickhut, who will begin speaking about the Large Lot Program.
Yes, I will. Good afternoon. Well, first of all, I'm not running the Large Lot Program right now. Jeannie Chandler is, and I have to say that because it's a lot of work. And she works with me, and we are beginning it. But the Large Lot Program came out of a neighborhood land use strategy. I guess I'll just sit down here. So it's an implementation strategy out of plan. Synthesis planning. We'll go over some of that. Oh yeah, God, this is. I don't like this two-screen thing you guys have here. Okay, so we spent about 3 years in the communities of Inglewood, West Inglewood, Washington Park, Woodlawn, and the southern half of New City, which is south of the Stockyards, doing a land use strategy. And so this is, you can see the bottom, a land use strategy to direct land use for a 10 to 20 year period. So that meant we had to have a lot of conversation in the neighborhood about what the heck is a land use strategy, especially in a neighborhood where there's a lot of issues, and like, you know, you want to talk about a 10 to 20 year land use strategy. So, you know, we have to try to explain and stay away from zoning pretty much, and say that the land use strategy portrays general distribution of land, identifies locations for uses, describes uses, and then directs land use for this period of time. So one of the things, if you look at a bunch of other cities like Detroit, Flint, a couple other ones, where there has been dramatic population decline. So these are the different community areas and the population from 1940 to 2010, and you can see it's like 60% decline. So the first part of the conversation is you have to get people to understand, you know, this is what we're dealing with. It's not like it's going to raise back up really quick, and so you can't think about whatever it was like 30 years ago. You're not planning for 30 years ago, you're planning for now. And this is what now looks like. So you lost 60% of the population. This is a map of those community areas, and the gray and blue is all vacant land. So with population decline of that amount, you also now have a lot of vacant land through foreclosures, through urban renewal, through other things. So this is what the landscape looks like. And the green are the big parks. So you have Jackson Park over there in the water, and Washington Park up there by the title. So we looked at a couple other cities just to you're not the only place where this has happened. Youngstown, Ohio, 30% decrease in residential land again. So, you know, what you're really dealing with is what are we going to do with all that land? So people like to come up with these nice little pictures. Pictures are good if they really resemble what you're gonna do. Cleveland, same kind of situation. They came up with reimagining a more sustainable Cleveland because they also had lost over half their population since 1950. Detroit, been doing a whole bunch. I think they've probably lost they have the most amount of land and have lost population. And they came up with this sort of, like I kind of say, a monopoly game. Problem with this monopoly game is there's actually people living in those houses or around them, and you can't just move stuff around because you want to create parcels. So that was, we shared with the community these other cities, and then we had to try to figure out how many people are we planning for in this geography. This plan we did with CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and they had previously done some housing projections as part of their 2040 plan for some suburbs. You can see there Oakwood, Oak Park, Maywood, Berwyn, and they were looking at trying to figure out how much housing would be needed by the year 2040. So they did that analysis for this geography. So first they did a population projection, GHN, Green Healthy Neighborhood, population projection. Those are the community areas on the left. So you can see that the population was projected to increase somewhat, except for Woodlawn, it was going to go down a bit. So some population increase by 2040 was projected. But then they also looked at household size projections, and across the country, you see more households with fewer people in them. That's just sort of the way that the world is working. So by 2040, all of the communities were going to have smaller household sizes. Then we looked at the number of households projected, and they did see some kind of increase, in the 10 to 15% increase by 2040 in terms of population projection. I mean, households projected. So we kind of know, well, good, this is good. There's some increase. Not huge, but there is upward trend. So then we looked at the number of units that were in the community area existing and what you needed by 2040. So you can see 2010, there were about, I don't know, fewer or less than 48,000 existing and another 16,000 vacant but available. And by 2040, you only needed 53,000. So basically what that meant is you don't need to build any more residential in these neighborhoods. You may have to rehab buildings, and there are nice buildings there, but you don't need new housing. So what that tells us is, okay, well, we're not going to fill up that vacant land with new housing because we already have enough for the population projected. So what could it look like giving that? And this is where we started having these conversations. Here's a rendering of an actual block down there on the left. Those are vacant lots next to actual houses there. And we started talking about residential buildings on larger than a standard city lot type in all but a few areas of this geography, except around transit nodes. One of our community partners talked about how this area, Washington Park, and this area were of the same sort of density as maybe Naperville, but they looked different. And they looked different for a variety of reasons. One is, vacancy here, land that is open in Naperville is owned. Land that is open here is not necessarily owned by the people that live there. So what can we do about that? So this is just a rendering. Yeah, what can we do about it? Well, why don't we just see if people want it? People that live there want it. And there was some people in the beginning in the community, oh, people aren't going to want it because they're not going to want to pay those taxes. Well, I don't know, let's see. So our neighborhood land use strategy, this housing is, we looked at all these things. I'm just going to talk about housing. Productive landscapes is what we are calling urban ag, which we put in certain locations. I don't know, Ben may have a few examples of that when he talks. But so this strategy is just the housing. So, and what do we have for a housing strategy? We don't need more, so policy one is reuse existing housing wherever possible. And as the historic preservationists say, the greenest building is the one that's already there. So these buildings on the right are actual buildings in the geography. These, I think, are mostly on Garfield Boulevard. There are nice buildings in this area. So let's reuse those. Let's get those in better shape. And then we also talked about developing a large lot program. Now, I'm going to show you these next slides are like the conversations we had in the Department of Planning and with some of the people that talk about zoning. So we're talking about, okay, let's increase the size of their parcels. How much should we increase them to? Well, in small residential, R1 through 3, we could go up to 100 front feet. But in other areas, we could only go up maybe 75 feet. And we'd have to work on the county with property tax issues, and we don't want large lots of transit nodes, because there we'd like to see density, if you're going to have density anywhere. We worked with the county, but there's nothing you can do about property taxes. So you can't like waive the property taxes if people have more land. It's just not possible. So, okay, that's something we had to tell people. This is an example of out there. So look at that person could have all that land and now they have a residential on a large lot. Or we were calling them estates of England, but since large lot has been taken over by other areas, it's large lots. And again, here's some other sites that this is all out there in that area. It's like maybe those people want that. Maybe they want to put the fence around it. And we've encountered people who, they did want extra land. This is just a map we did of the residential zoning. So you can see that pretty much all of the area, in purple, both light and dark, is residential zoned to the amount that we were talking about. So it's not high density residential. So in all of that area, large lots would be a program. So this is what we talked about. Then, so we've been working on this a couple of years. We had an open house in the community, March of 13, and we gave them all, we had the boards up and we talked about, we had little stations and people could come and talk about the recommendations we were proposing. So I was manning the housing one. So here's the board we had up there. This is what we talked about. And we talked about, giving lots to the people that are on the block. Now, one of the main comments we got is, that's a really good idea. We don't want it open up to anybody. We want to be able to get that land. And I had been in Detroit, I think, previous year or so, and talked to people there where like 1,000 lots went to one individual to do some kind of urban farm. And then when you talk to the community groups, they were all upset because they couldn't get that land. It's not that they didn't want it, there was just no program for them to get it. So that did not go over very well. And that project has had some problems because somebody had an idea for that neighborhood, but it wasn't the people that were in that neighborhood. So, here, let's reuse our buildings and develop a large lot program. So this is a map I brought out because I thought, hey, maybe, first of all, we're not going to be able to talk to all these people. How are we going to get these recruits? So we've been working with different organizations like I had on this. These are people we've been working with. So when I had the board up, I said, hey, this is a program, they liked it. I said, well, how would you, we're not going to be able to go out to neighbors. So could you just maybe show me where you were going to do that and give me your name? So this is like Englewood F. So they made some boxes around where they would talk to people. So it's like, looks like we got enough of a program here. We can maybe pull this off. Here's the map that we then took back, and this is the area where we think we have clients. We have an organization in the community that would go out and talk to somebody and drum up some clients for this. Because again, people they're kind of skeptical about this. There's a lot of different reactions to this large lot program. And Jeannie, who is now running it, so she started working with RAGE, which is Residents Association of Greater Englewood, one of the newer community groups, and they did a little survey of people in the area. They collected information from 60 interested parties. All right, good. So we think there's about 60 people, at least. Maybe we'll have 60 people. So then Jeannie worked with the community organizations and really refined the program criteria. So, we had sort of a general idea, but then this is what with communications with the community organization. So the goals were for the city to dispose of some of the city-owned land. What are we holding on for it? I don't know. People always think something's going to happen. In the meantime, nothing happens, and why can't these people that live there have this land? Allow residents to have greater control over vacant land and create wealth. So, some people go, oh, we got to make the city more dense. We give it to these people, and listen, if somebody wants to buy the lot from them, let them buy the lot from them. It's not like, it'd be a lot easier to buy from some residential owner than the city, I assure you. So let them make the wealth if there's wealth to be made. So then the criteria that, again, the neighborhood groups came up with, okay, you have to own property on the block. So you don't actually have to live there, but you have to own property on the block. Nonprofits could apply, but they had to have, articles of incorporation. You have to be free just like any other property owner. You can't have taxes, any debt to the city. It's got to be zoned residential. You're going to have to do whatever you have to do by code, existing code. And churches are not eligible. And the reason for that, the community, was they're not paying taxes, so we don't want them to. We're not going to open up the churches. So with Jeannie and the community, developed this program application. Not very much, one page. You do have to provide your deed, so you got to know where your deed of your property is. And we compared this to a previous program that had started in the late 80s, which was called the Adjacent Neighbors Acquisition Program. But that one had a lot of more restrictions than this one, and that's something we heard in the community. Like, for example, one thing is you could only get one lot through the ANLAP program. And we had people that had a garden on one lot, they had their house, a garden, and then another lot next door, but they couldn't get that from the city because of the regulation. Because we had a program, we couldn't do that. We also had to pay money, and we did not, we were going to give it to people for $1. There was an application fee. We actually did not have an application fee at the end. You had to hold the property for 10 years. We were saying 5 years. So we made it a little easier. And the rationale, of course, goes back to the plan because there's so much land and there's nothing in the foreseeable future. So that gets people like, okay, let's do this. So the mayor announced the large lot program the same time that the plan went to Plan Commission. This program was also adopted by the 5-year housing plan for the department, which meant that not only was it eligible in this particular geography, but it could be eligible in any other place that the city decided. So anyway, March of this year, the program was announced. We were woefully unprepared for all of the people that started calling and dropping off applications. We had a paper application. We had it on the city's website, if you've ever been to, is not really that friendly for the average person. So about 2 weeks into the program, one of our community members, Devon Drummond from Teamwork Inglewood, apparently was sitting down with his mom. She was trying to fill it out on the city website and all, couldn't figure it out. So he worked with some people because his organization was working on improving the community's access to the web and all kinds of services on the web. So they were funded by LISC, they were funded by some philanthropy, worked with this data maid, and they developed a program using open source data. So they took the city's list, which we had on our website, they took the county's list, and those pictures and all that are county data. They developed this map, they put the application online, and so people could go onto a lot and they could get all this information, they could type in an address, it was really user-friendly. So, it had all these hits, 244 applications were downloaded. We got, as a result of primarily this and the big community involvement, we got 550 lots requested in this geography for 427 applications. So again, people could apply for more than one lot. You could get up to 2. We just introduced last week, or maybe it was this week, I don't know. I think we're down to now about, let's say, 250 applicants into city council. So now they've gone to city council because we have to do a lot of legislative stuff and we have to close on them. So those have been introduced to council to be sold to all these individuals. Oh yeah, here's a map. You can see the red dots. So you can see it's got a nice distribution across the whole geography of where people applied for these lots. And it says here, on April 21st, the last day, we got 100 applications in person. We didn't even have an inbox in the department for this, so it was kind of crazy. And so previously, just by kind of comparison, the city through the ANLAP program was selling about maybe 40 lots a year. We will look like we're going to be closing at about 230 or so this year. So it's totally different than anything that we've done before. And all these people, they have deeds to their property, they've been in the neighborhood for a while. We do have some cases, more so in Woodlawn over there, where we have developers who bought lots, and now they bought a couple more lots, and they plan to do housing. Good for them. So that is that. That's the program.
So I purposefully started with a wintry picture of a community garden. Just because people are usually used to seeing pictures of community gardens with happy children and things growing, but we live in Chicago and it snows a lot and it's cold a lot of the year round, so this is the reality for a community garden. This is a lovely garden. This is the Frankie Machine Garden in West Town. You'll see a little bit more Frankie Machine as we move forward. Before I even dive into Neighborspace, I wanted to just spend some time telling a story of a real-life garden in Chicago that is no longer with us. Some people might have visited if you were down in the Woodlawn neighborhood. back a few years ago, the 61st and Dorchester Community Garden. It was on the northeast corner, 61st and Dorchester, and had a almost decade-long career there. And it was home to 135 household vegetable plots. So 135 households, probably 500 to 800 people actively gardening in this site for almost a decade. The roots of the garden go back even further. You talk to people who gardened there. And sorry, this is a little bit fuzzy, but it was screenshots from a video project with the Invisible Institute, which is a wonderful collective of journalists at the experimental station in Woodlawn. And while this garden was in its final days, they decided that they needed to document the life there. And you could go to the garden store, garden conversations, and listen to a lot of these. And you learn all about the life in the garden, which is something you don't learn about when you just drive by or walk by a garden generally. You learn what it really meant to people. Well, first, this gentleman was able to tell us that the roots of the garden go back 30 years before we all thought it did, to a lot across the street there. And that he got started because he was helping out with a friend's garden, which was the way most people got started in this garden. But that more than anything, this garden to him was a sanctuary. It was a place where you could get away from the troubles of life and nobody would mess with you. This is Jeanette Spencer. And you listen to her and she talks about the garden helping her to heal and helping others to heal through the really simple lesson that the community gardens in particular teach, because people in the garden turn to each other to learn. You don't know how to do something, you see somebody growing tomatoes expertly in the next plot, you're going to talk to them. That happens over and over and over again. The learning never stops. And the side effect, or maybe the primary effect of that, is it helps you heal. For a lot of people in Chicago and other cities, live in dense neighborhoods, they live in condos, they live in apartments, they may have a balcony, but they do not have access to a lot of open space. If they do have access to open space, it's not the kind of open space where you can really get your fingers in the dirt, generally. There are exceptions. So we do hear this kind of story a lot, that this is their open space. And that woman came to the garden with her kids every day in the summertime. This last gardener gets at a little bit more of a metaphysical side. I don't have a planning degree. My dad's a landscape architect, but my background is at the divinity school. So that's what draws me to this kind of work. And this woman talked about how the garden taught her through the cycles of the seasons, resiliency and hope, that even if something's going to die, it's going to come back the next year and you can try again. An incredibly important lesson for life, which we really do not have a lot of places to learn that kind of humility and patience and self-care. That can happen in a garden. Sorry to be a downer, but this is what that looks like today. The garden was demolished at the end of the season in 2009. It was on University of Chicago-owned land. They needed the land to end up using as a staging area for a building they were building. If you look in the upper right there, you see a little nest of trees. That was the gathering of trees. I don't know why they left it there, just as kind of an insult to the garden. But it's still there as a reminder of what once was, this little den in the garden. But the story doesn't end there. Even before the 61st and Dorchester garden was removed, Neighborspace was working with the gardeners, with the aldermen, with the University of Chicago, who actually was a very good partner while the garden was being removed, and the experimental station and other stakeholders in the neighborhood to try to come up with a plan B. A big note is that I was working on a plan B and others were working on a plan B. The gardeners were always working on plan A, which is why those videos exist, because they were actively trying to fight the university and I think in the win public opinion to sway them to keep the garden there as an asset for the community and for students, was the argument. They did not win, but Plan B did take root. And thankfully, just a block and a half south of 61st and Dorchester, 62nd and Dorchester, there was a big piece of city-owned land. This parcel right here, and then another one across the street. And so the garden got to work trying to move the garden, and I put move in scare quotes because you don't really ever move a garden. Some of the original gardeners did move, some plants actually did move, some dirt actually did move, soil did move, but for the most part it was kind of a new garden nearby that was reborn with some roots in the previous garden. And so here's an action shot of that taking place, and this was the result. This is an aerial shot. You can see the two halves of the garden separated by a little Chicago Park District play lot. But the new site has about this, actually a few more plots than the original garden. Each one of those squares has 4 family plots in it. It's really one of the biggest community gardens in Chicago now. And if all goes well, in just a couple of weeks, Neighborspace is going to take title to both sides of the garden. It's been a 3-year-long effort, but we're at the final stages. And long and short of it is 9 years from now, this garden group, all of these gardeners are not going to be asked to leave. They have a permanent home on this site. This is not a pop-up garden. They can plant trees and rest assured that they're going to be able to harvest the fruit. They can begin events in the garden that have the chance of becoming traditions in the garden. And one of those you see up down there on the left. They have the tradition of setting, this is from actually the garden around the corner, but this garden does the same, but they set the fence back 10 feet and they allow anything outside the garden to be picked by passersby. It's actually a weird anti-theft mechanism. And children that grow up in this garden will actually be able to potentially bring their children there and grow up and take on leadership positions in the garden, which really is one of the great benefits of community gardening. So there's a happy ending to the 61st and Dorchester tale. And then to jump back to Neighborspace. So where does Neighborspace come from? A long ago Department of Planning and Development plan, which Kathy also worked on, the City Space Plan. In the mid-90s, this was kind of the signature open space plan of the early Daley administration, second Daley administration. And it was a vision of how to bring new and more open space to Chicago. And it came up with some wonderful ideas, which we're benefiting from today, like reclaiming the river, campus parks, using unused school grounds. And then somebody noticed that, hey, in neighborhoods where there's not a lot of other types of open space, communities will just organize and take over lots, city lots, private lots, and create their own parks, their own gardens, their own nature areas, their own school gardens. And wouldn't it be great if we could just make these permanent? And so it came up with a recommendation to create what would become Neighborspace, an entity that would oversee these community-created and managed sites, and to ensure them, and to help oversee them and help provide resources for them. And the insurance and the resources and the oversight are a key piece of this. I think there was a lot of benevolence in the founders and the creators of the City Space Plan that these are great sites that can bring open space to underserved areas, but there was also some anxiety on the part of the city when people are just squatting on city-owned land without permission to be there and without anybody ensuring the activities that are going on there. So one of the big things that Neighborspace provides is liability insurance. And the other thing, kind of similar to the large lots program, is some kind of oversight. We're vetting the groups that are wanting to become part of Neighborspace, and making sure that they have the capacity to do so. Neighborspace fills a gap not filled by the traditional park and preserve systems. We have 2 great open space systems in Chicago, the Chicagoland area, but for the most part, Neighborspace focuses on these very small sites, less than a half acre. It tends to be not cost effective for the park district to develop tiny little sites like this, though they certainly do exist. They're community created, they're community established. Yes, you have park advisory committees that are raising money to rehab playgrounds and whatnot, but it's not exactly the same thing as a block club or a CDC rallying around a vacant space, coming up with their own plan for it, and physically building it or raising funds to have it built. It's a different kind of animal. And then there's no staff on the other end to come and maintain it. There's no crew that's going to come through and mow it. There's no crew that's going to come through and weed it. It genuinely is stewarded by the community group. I remember 7 years ago when I first started, I sat down in Kathy's office and you said, you may not remember this, how does it feel to run an all-volunteer miniature park district? And I was like, oh wow, you make it sound really daunting, but it's true. There's now about 100 Neighborspace sites around the city, and we have a staff of 2 full-time people, 3 part-time people. We're not out there weeding. It's all done by the community group. It's a very unique kind of open space in the city. Somebody once described it to me as like trying to understand. They're like, well, it's not exactly private, it's not exactly public. I'm like, yeah, it's that gray area in between. Space where communities can directly impact their built environment, and I would add, importantly, they can recreate those spaces. One of the things we've learned in more than 15 years of Neighborspace is that sites are always evolving. So a site may begin as a vegetable garden, and then the community group changes and they decide they want to do something else with it. They can do that, and Neighborspace will be there to support them. You can't do that park district sites definitely do change, but it's not quite in the same way. And then I would lastly say that they're governed by the community group. Neighborspace has a kind of a loose requirements in terms of governance. We need people to be our go-to people at the garden, but the garden gets to decide how they want to run. They can be a pure democracy, a benevolent dictatorship, a group of note-taking committees. We have them all, as long as there's something. So in 18 years, we now have 96 sites owned or leased, mostly owned, and we're going to surpass. We have about 15 sites in process, so we will probably break into the 100 mark in 2015. And I would note, I think probably of interest to this group is that we are still guided in many ways by the city space plan. It ranked, one of the things it did was rank community areas by per capita open space, 77 community areas, and we always are trying to target those areas that are underserved. I think we take a more granular look at it now than 15 years ago. So we'll look, there could be a community area that, the whole community area is lacking open space, or it has plenty of open space, but one little pocket is lacking. We can target right there, or vice versa. A site that has no real need for open space according to statistics, but we can jump right in there in an area that has maybe a few low-rise apartment buildings. We can work with the community to target a community open space in that neighborhood. So the neighborhood with the least amount of open space in the city still is Little Village, also known as South Lawndale. And in the last few years, we've been able to work on 3 new community gardens there. 2 which are already established and 1 which is on the way. What you see here is it's called the 6062 Tree, community garden. We don't name them. That's a testament to that the governing group gets to name it and rename it if they so choose, which gets a little confusing for us sometimes. I need to put a moratorium on the naming gardens, the Garden of Hope or Children's Garden, because we don't know which one we're talking about half the time. So this is one of the new gardens in Little Village, and I'll use this as a chance to talk about the Neighborspace process. So the group, there's a few things Neighborspace looks at when a group comes to us, and we don't go out and find a piece of vacant land and then knock on a door and say, hey, you should do a community garden there. Groups really do come to us with their own visions and their ideas, and then we take our cues from them. But in reviewing the application, we're looking for an alignment of the group, their capacity, the land, the environment, the soil itself, and the politics. And really all things need to line up for the project to move forward. Any one of these out of line can derail the process. So a group submits a proposal to Neighborspace, laying out their plan and their vision. This particular case in Lasse was the CDC in the neighborhood, and they came to us with a plan for, I think, 6 open spaces. So they had a big vision for a bunch of different open spaces. This was the only one that was city-owned land, so we focused our attention on this one. And we vetted it for the group's capacity. You'd be surprised how many applications we get where it's like, yeah, we want to do a community garden, and we look at the application and there's 2 people on it. We're like, that's not necessarily a community garden. You need to talk to your neighbors. And sometimes we never hear from that group again, but sometimes they're like, oh, I get it. And they go out and they start organizing, which is exactly what we want. And after, let's say it passes that initial hurdle, then I'll present it to the Neighborspace board. We have a 13-member board, which is made up of half government appointees and half appointees from the private sector. And if the board likes it, they will make a motion for me to move forward. And then the next step is environmental assessments. So for every site we acquire, we make sure that it's safe for gardening. And so we're going to do phase 1, phase 2 environmental assessments. And depending on the results, this can often be the big unknown that derails a project. We're in Chicago. There's all sorts of weird stuff in the soil. We've seen it all. Last year, I had to hire an archaeologist to make sure that there wasn't a cemetery on a site that people were actively gardening on. Thankfully, there was not a cemetery, but we did find some weird tunnels, which we're now filling with concrete. So you never know what you're going to get. Usually, we get a result that says, there are kind of standard Chicago fill, and we don't recommend that you garden in the soil, but if you use what we call environmental best practices, put down mulch and landscape cloth and garden above ground, that's fine, we can move forward. So then Neighborspace will move forward through the acquisition process. At this site, it was pretty severely contaminated, and thankfully there were funds available in the open space impact fees, which is a fund for new open space development collected by community areas. And the aldermen supported using the funds to essentially scrape out 3 feet of what was there, have it disposed of in a safe site, and put in a cap, a 3-foot cap, and then garden on top of that. So they're in the clear for now and forever. And actually now we're looking at the 4 lots that are around it to hopefully expand the site. So the full acquisition process takes anywhere between 8-9 months to the longest I've seen is actually a decade. That was a total fluke, but usually it's about 1.5 to 2 years to get through the whole process, which can seem like a really long time, and we have groups grow very impatient because there's an eagerness to just get growing quickly. But once it's acquired, it's forever, and that's the whole point. You go through a couple of years of pain and jumping through hoops and getting through the right committees, but then you don't have to worry about that ever again. You don't have to worry about your environmental safety. Once you are a Neighborspace garden, we enter into an ongoing partnership agreement. This is what we revisit over and over again with the group. After we own it, we are constantly working with the garden group, working with the garden leaders to make sure that they have what they need, that they're following the basic guidelines, that they're getting resources that we can connect them with, that they're continuing to follow safe practices. So this is, we're constantly kind of tending different corners of this equation. This is what we're shooting for. I would say of the 96 gardens we protect, only about a quarter have this in perfect harmony, that we never need to worry about. Most of them are somewhere in the middle. They're still doing community organizing. They're still doing that outreach. They're still working with the the institutions in their community, reaching out to the CDC or the church or the school down the street to build relationships. We know that that's a work in progress, and it always will be. The point is that you really never stop organizing, and we're there to support them with that. So we've secured almost 100 sites, but we know from various mapping projects and outreach that that's only about a quarter of the community gardens in Chicago. There's still hundreds of gardens that are not protected, and that we've learned from the story of 61st and Dorchester are very likely to disappear. There are some that are relatively secure, like Park District has about 15 to 20 community vegetable gardens on Park District land. Those aren't going to disappear, or the open space isn't going to disappear. If the group ceases to be interested in vegetable gardening, the Park District will return that to a field or whatever it was before that. And that's actually likely to happen at some point. This garden is no longer there. This garden was lost this season, really just a few months ago, in the Humboldt Park neighborhood. Thankfully, it moved just a block away to another vacant piece of land. But that land is also insecure. That land is a privately held piece of land. I don't know if this site could. This was a wonderful community garden in Humboldt Park. Really just in some ways like a poster child for what I think community gardens can be. Vegetable garden, a real community gathering space. And there was rarely an evening in the summer where people were not cooking outdoors there. And the strawberries in my garden were picked up from this garden when it was demolished because they made an effort to find new homes for everything that was in there. And I took them with a little bit of sadness. In addition to those 300 gardens that don't have protection, I would say there's hundreds more that haven't really even had the opportunity to take root. And let me explain what I mean by that. But there's a lot of unused open space in the city. We've learned from the large lots program, but there's other types of open space: railroad-owned properties, MWRD-owned properties, unused CDOT right-of-way, where people are in their neighborhoods. They may be eyeing it. They may go by it every day, and they may wonder, what could I do with that? They may talk with their neighbors. I would like to do something with that, but they don't know how to do it. They don't feel that there are the resources there. If they do try, they call up the railroad once, and they're going to reach somebody on the other line that says, "What do you mean? I can't do that." Or do you have $3 million liability insurance? How many of you have that? I don't. So they hit a brick wall, and those sites never have a chance to take root. Neighborspace really is designed for both of those gardens that are at risk, that exist and are at risk. We can work on city-owned land, private land, and also those sites that haven't taken root. This is an example of a recent garden that we acquired last year. In the upper left, you see what it looked like a couple of years ago. The community had claimed this. This is in the corner, incredibly busy corner, on the corner of Avondale and Addison. Huge bus route. Train stop is right around the corner from there. Thousands of people walking by this every morning on the way to get to transit. And it was kind of a muddy walk through. The community organized enough to put some flower boxes there. And then they weren't willing to invest any more until it was secured in some way. They were scared, it was railroad property, that it was going to be taken away at the drop of a hat, which it could be. So they approached Neighborspace to be the go-between between them and the railroad, which we are now, and we entered into a lease with the railroad, and we hold the insurance so that the group has more security on this site. And then they felt comfortable to actually do a more full-scale planting and actually put a brick patio there. In the back, you can see there's actually a walk-through now. So now these thousands of people get to enjoy a little garden, a beautiful mural, and they don't have to go through mud to get there every morning. It's small, but it means a lot in the that minute in people's lives every morning, compounded monthly. Adds up to a big difference in their day-to-day lives. We do this, in this way, Neighborspace unlocks a lot of unused spaces in the city. We have similar leases in place with CDOT, MWRD. We have several leases in place with MWRD is, I think, the second largest landholder in the city. Huge potential there. if community groups organized, they could tap into a lot of those spaces through Neighborspace. And then last year we entered into our first lease with Chicago Housing Authority. There was a group also in Humboldt Park that wanted to have a community garden, and they weren't able to because they didn't have liability insurance. And now it's a thriving community garden. I mean, the classic example of community gardens the tale is community gardens that are secured and protected from evil developers. That, they're not always evil, A, but B, that's not the main story that we see at Neighborspace. Here's an example where it kind of is the story. This is one of Neighborspace's first gardens. This is the wintry scene you saw at the beginning, the Frankie Machine Garden, which actually preceded Neighborspace. It was owned by the Community Association, and then they did not want, when Neighborspace was created, they decided they didn't want to have the liability of owning this property, so Neighborspace took it on, and this is in Westtown. If this was sitting open now, there's no question this would be, or if Neighborspace hadn't acquired, there's no question that this would be a 4-story condo building. And the lot 2 blocks south that Neighborspace also owns would be a 3-4-story condo building. You've already seen a little bit of it, but Neighborspace gardens come in all different shapes and sizes. The predominant vision is of a vegetable garden, community allotment garden broken up into plots. We have a lot of that, that's the trend these days, but we also have habitat restoration sites like this site along the Chicago River. It's an 1.5 acres that we leased from MWRD, or the Hoxie Prairie in South Deering, far south side, which is really like a barbecue garden. It has 3 barbecue pits, it's incredible, but a real community gathering space. I can't make this point enough, but it comes in all different shapes and sizes because communities come in all different shapes and sizes, and they have many different visions. And the vision is theirs, and it's up to Neighborspace to support that vision and be the kind of agnostic third party that secures the land, deals with insurance, deals with other red tape, provides resources so that their visions can be a reality in their community. Be it for food, be it for play, which is a big trend these days, nature play, be it for habitat, be it for learning. Growing for donation is a huge trend you see these days. This is a garden in Uptown, Ginkgo Organic Garden. This isn't the garden, this is where they bring their food every week. All the food, minus what people pick when they're volunteering, goes to a food pantry in Uptown. We've all heard about urban agriculture, and we might talk about that more in the discussion time, but gardens for job training, for larger scale urban agriculture is definitely something we've seen, and Neighborspace this is not the site we own, but we own a site a block away for Growing Home, and we're working now with other urban agriculture organizations in the city to secure land for them, with Windy City Harvest, with Growing Power, for them to do the work that they do. And then I'll end, which is probably on the trend which is closest to my heart, which is broadly called placemaking these days, which means everything and nothing, like so many terms. But there's an increased understanding that community gardens are a place where neighborhood-created culture happens. And this is something we see. We've heard from gardeners they want more support in this realm. So they want support in growing things. There's a lot of support there. But they also want support in how to pull this off. How to do a pumpkin carving. It may seem obvious when we're sitting around the table, but if you're a gardener and you're used to just growing vegetables, it may not seem obvious about how to pull off an event, or how to do a kids program, how to do a scavenger hunt. All of those things are important in making a community garden successful. So, community gardens have been in Chicago a long time, going back more than 100 years. That's Eckerd Park, I think, in the upper right there on Chicago Avenue. Is that right? Chicago Avenue. This is in World War I, or World War II, the Victory Gardens. And there's Mayor-elect Emanuel at the Fulton Street Flower and Garden, a Neighborspace protected garden in Garfield Park. And because it's Halloween, I just threw that in there. This is a squatter garden over by Midway. But just to underscore the fact that, like people's front porches, people are decorating their gardens with the seasons. They're living, breathing places, both literally and figuratively. So, thank you. This is how you can contact me.
thanks Ben and Kathleen coming out and talking about their work at the very edge of some of the theoretical ideas we grapple with at school. And I think that's a good point to sort of take up on the discussion that follows my little introduction. Some of the larger theoretical ideas, that's what grappled my interest. For most of the 20th century, planners sort of spend their time talking about and trying to de-densify the city, right? And manage urban growth. And at the end of the 20th century, we sort of reach a position where the city has been de-densified to a great extent that there is vacancy in the city. And the urban growth that we've been trying to manage has gone to the very edge of the urban regions. So we have this situation where the inside of the city is increasingly empty, and the edges of the city are where the action and growth and the riches are. That's a very different vision of the city at some level. What kind of city that is? Do we sort of think of this as a shrinking city, as a city in continuous urban decline, but a success of planning at a very level where it fails simultaneously that it has succeeded in setting out to do of de-densifying. So I'm sure you guys have questions that sort of speak to their work more generally. But what intrigues me here is the larger theoretical aspect of the work both Kathleen and Ben are doing. So if this has succeeded at the very level that the city is now de-densified in its very heart, and we have the city government beginning to retrench, beginning to sort of go back and living large parts of the city and vacant lots to communities and people to manage by themselves. And then is the broader policy landscape where we have an increasingly aging population and not a very growing economic scenario. Where do you think this ends up in next 20 years? As a future-oriented activity, and that's what planners try to do all the time, trying to imagine if these trends hold true, and if you guys are successful in your work, which I absolutely want you to be, 20 years down the line, how would these parts of the city look spatially? What would be sort of the urban form? What kind of densities? Like we had the figure of Naperville kind of density with larger lots, and socially. Do you think the city would be able to support the kind of civic services, the kind of quality of life for both poor and rich? And that would be a good starting point, I think, for the discussion, and then we can have questions going forward. Who sort of wants to take that point?
All right. Well, you just said a lot. So I don't know that we're looking to we're not looking at a de-densification idea for the city. So that's not why we came up with large lots at all. It wasn't an intentional de-densification. There's a lot of social reasons why that part of the city is not dense right now. So we're looking at it as stabilize, and then people will stabilize the community, stabilize the land, and then people will want to return to the area. And it may be a different mix of people, but we're not really looking to this is not like a de-densification idea. It's a way to stabilize that part of the city, because it's not true that all parts of the city are de-densified. I mean, there's definitely parts of the city that we're seeing a lot of population growth, we're seeing a lot of real estate activity. It's just that we have 8 cities within a city. So. But
you are saying that accepting the fact of the density of those neighborhoods and saying this is probably about how it's going to stay. That seems like.
But yeah, right. Well, yeah, that's how it's going to stay unless you do something.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to do something. And what is the something? The something is there's people that live there. They are the stakeholders. They're the only ones keeping the community alive. What are we going to do? Go back to urban renewal, which is to move people out and then